5 years ago, they threw stones at her and called it justice. They drove her into the dead zone to starve, leaving her with nothing but a forbidden mark on her skin and a heart full of ash. But tonight, the Iron Claw pack is learning that some fires are better left unquenched. As the Alpha King Kalen collapses into a shell of translucent ice, dying from a curse no healer can touch, the very girl they tried to erase is the only one who can keep their world from shattering. The monster they created is now their only savior, but to save the king who broke her, Elara must decide if a pack that chose cruelty deserves the warmth of her soul. The Great Hall of the Iron Claw pack didn't smell like victory anymore. It smelled like wet fur, copper blood, and something much worse: ice. Alpha King Kalen stood at the head of the long stone table, his golden eyes scanning the 100 warriors before him. He was a god in human form, 6'4" of scarred muscle and unbreakable authority. Under his rule, the pack had never known defeat, but tonight the air around him was vibrating. "The border patrols are silent," Kalen's voice rasped, sounding like grinding stones. "The forest is dying. Whatever this winter is, it isn't coming from the sky." Suddenly, Kalen gasped. The sound was sharp, a jagged intake of breath that silenced the entire room. His hand, thick with calluses, slammed onto the table, but he wasn't leaning on it, he was clinging to it. "Alpha," Silas, his second-in-command, stepped forward, his face pale. "Kalen, what is—" Kalen couldn't answer. A visible tremor shook his massive frame. Then came the sound that would haunt the pack for years, the sound of cracking glass. Right before their eyes, Kalen's skin turned a translucent, sickly blue. A thin layer of frost began to crawl up his throat, tracing his veins like a spiderweb of diamonds. He tried to shift, his muscles bulging as his inner wolf fought to break free, but the transformation stalled. A choked howl died in his chest. The Alpha King, the strongest wolf in the northern hemisphere, collapsed. He hit the floor with a heavy thud that shook the rafters. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. "Get the healers!" Silas screamed, his voice cracking into a panicked roar. "Now!" The hall exploded into chaos. Warriors scrambled, chairs were overturned, and the scent of fear, sour and thick, choked the room. The healers rushed to Kalen's side, but as soon as the lead matron touched his chest, she shrieked and pulled back. Her fingertips were black, instant frostbite. "He's freezing," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "He's freezing from the inside out. His heart, it's turning to a block of ice." Outside, the midsummer sun vanished. A localized blizzard slammed into the packhouse, shattering the stained glass windows. Snow began to pile on the floor, but it wasn't white. It was a deep, bruised violet. The elders huddled in the corner, their faces etched with a guilt they couldn't hide. One of them, a man whose hair was as white as the encroaching storm, gripped his staff until his knuckles turned white. "This isn't natural," the elder breathed, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "It's the blood frost, the forbidden curse." Silas grabbed the elder by his robes, lifting him off the floor. "Then fix it! Use the pack magic! Do something!" "We can't," the elder whimpered. "We burned the scrolls. We killed the practitioners. We exiled the only bloodline that could handle soul binding." The room went deathly quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Everyone knew who he meant. 5 years ago, they had stood on the borders and thrown stones at a girl who had done nothing but try to heal a dying pup. They had called her a witch. They had called her a monster. They had stripped her of her rank, her clothes, and her dignity, and driven her into the dead zone, the wasteland where no wolf could survive. Kalen had been the one to sign the decree. Kalen had been the one to watch her bleed and offer no mercy. The frost on Kalen's face was thickening now, forming a mask of ice that threatened to shatter his very soul. His heartbeat was a faint metallic tink, tink, tink. Silas looked at his dying king, then at the frozen wasteland outside. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the gut. "The Omega," Silas whispered, his voice trembling with mixture of hope and pure, unadulterated dread. There was only one wolf who could stop this, the one they tried to erase, the one who was currently starving in a cave, waiting for the world to burn. Silas turned to the fastest scouts in the room, his eyes burning with desperation. "Find Elara, tell her the king is dying, and tell her if she doesn't come back, we all die with him."
The storm wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside their lungs. In the 20 minutes since Alpha King Kalen had collapsed, the Great Hall had transformed into a tomb of ice. The violet snow continued to pile against the doors, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to a living thing. "He stopped shivering," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. That was the worst sign. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. Stillness meant the body had accepted its fate. Kalen lay on the stone dais, his skin now the color of a winter moon. The frost had moved from his throat to his eyes, sealing them shut under a layer of jagged crystal. "We can't wait for the scouts," Silas roared, turning to the panicked crowd. "The curse is spreading. Look at the walls." The warriors gasped. The ancient oak pillars of the pack house were cracking. Blue frost was bleeding out of the wood, crawling across the floor like frozen snakes. Every wolf it touched fell to their knees, clutching their limbs as their joints began to seize. "It's a plague," a young mother sobbed, pulling her pup closer. "The king's curse is feeding on us." The elder, Malachi, shook his head, his eyes haunted. "No, the king is the anchor. If his heart freezes completely, the bond between Alpha and Pack will snap. When it breaks, every wolf tied to his soul will turn to ice where they stand." Death wasn't just coming for Kalen, it was coming for the entire bloodline. 5 miles away, in the region known as the Dead Zone, the air was silent. This was a place where the earth was scorched and the water was poison. No prey lived here, no trees grew. It was a graveyard of dust and jagged rock. Inside a shallow cave, a woman sat cross-legged. She was thin, painfully so. Her collarbones jutted out like knives, and her gray tunic was little more than rags. But her eyes were a piercing, vibrant violet that matched the color of the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Elara felt the shift in the wind before she heard the feet. She felt the sharp, agonizing pang in her chest, the phantom pain of a pack bond she had been severed from years ago. She gasped, clutching her heart. Kalen, she thought. The name felt like a sin on her tongue. She had spent 5 years hating him. She had spent 5 years replaying the moment he had looked her in the eye and told the guards to throw the trash out. She remembered the weight of the stones hitting her back. She remembered the way he hadn't blinked when she screamed for mercy. Now she felt him dying. "Stay away," Elara whispered to the empty cave. "Stay away, stay away, stay away." But the scent hit her, the scent of iron claw wolves. It was mixed with the smell of ozone and rot. 3 scouts skidded to a halt at the mouth of her cave. They were elite warriors, men who had once mocked her for being a useless Omega. Now they looked like terrified children. Their hands were shaking, and frost was already nipping at their ears. "Elara!" The lead scout, Riker, gasped. He didn't demand. He didn't growl. He dropped to both knees. "Please." Elara didn't move. Her expression remained as cold as the stone she sat on. "You're trespassing. The decree said if I stepped foot on pack land, I'd be executed. If you step foot in my cave, I should have the same right." "The king is falling," Riker pleaded, ignoring her threat. "The blood frost has him. The elders say only soul binding can redirect the ice. Only you have the mark." Elara stood up slowly. Her movements were fluid, predatory,
despite her starvation. She pulled back her tattered sleeve, revealing a glowing silver geometric tattoo that spiraled from her wrist to her elbow. It pulsed with a dark, forbidden heat. "You call it a mark now?" Elara's voice was a low hiss. "5 years ago, you called it a brand of the devil. You burned my mother's house down because of this mark." "We're wrong," Riker cried out. A crack appeared on his cheek, a sliver of ice blooming in the wound. "The whole pack is freezing, Elara. There are pups in there. If Kaelin dies, we all die." Elara looked past them, toward the distant mountains where the Ironclaw fortress sat. She could see the violet vortex swirling above it. She could feel the Alpha King's life force flickering like a candle in a hurricane. She remembered his hands, not just the hands that signed her exile, but the hands that once, a long time ago, had shared bread with her when they were children, before he became king, before the world told him an Alpha couldn't love an Omega. A bitter smile touched her lips. "Does he want me to save him?" she asked. "The man who left me to die in the dirt wants me to offer my soul to keep him warm?" "He's your Alpha," Riker whispered. "He stopped being my Alpha the second he let the first stone fly," Elara replied. She began to turn back into the shadows of her cave, but a massive wave of psychic agony hit her. Kaelin's wolf let out a silent, spiritual howl that echoed in the minds of every Ironclaw member. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering. Elara stumbled, her hand hitting the cave wall. Her soul-binding mark flared bright red, burning her skin. The magic was reacting. It was calling to the curse, hungry to feed. She looked at the scouts. They were dying. If she did nothing, she would be the last Ironclaw wolf alive. She would be alone in the silence forever. "Get up," Elara snapped, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and reluctant pity. "Get up before I change my mind." "You'll come?" Riker asked, hope blooming in his eyes. Elara stepped out into the light, the wind whipping her matted hair across her face. "I'll come," she said, her violet eyes flashing, "but not for him. I'm coming to watch him realize that the monster he created is the only thing keeping his heart beating." As they began the trek back, the ground beneath them suddenly turned to glass. A massive shadow moved beneath the ice of the dead zone, following them. Elara froze, her magic screaming a warning she hadn't felt in years. "Run," she whispered. "The curse. It's not waiting for us to get to the palace. It's hunting us." The gates of the Ironclaw fortress didn't groan as they opened. They shattered. The ice had claimed the hinges, turning the massive iron-bound oak into brittle glass. As Elara stepped across the threshold, the silence that fell over the courtyard was heavier than the blizzard. Hundreds of wolves stood frozen in place, some literally, their feet rooted to the stone by creeping frost, others simply paralyzed by the sight of her. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was gaunt, her clothes were rags, and her scent was that of the dead zone, ash and survival. "Is that her?" a warrior whispered, his breath hitching. "The Omega? She shouldn't be alive," another muttered, though he quickly stepped back as Elara's violet eyes swept over him. Elara didn't stop. She didn't look at the faces of the people who had cheered when she was dragged away in chains. She kept her eyes on the great hall, where the vortex of violet energy was screaming. Silas met her at the top of the stairs. He was shivering, his tactical gear dusted with frost. He looked at her tattered sleeves and the glowing silver mark on her arm. "You took your time," Silas snapped, his voice a mix of relief and habitual arrogance. Elara stopped one step below him, forcing him to look down. "I could turn around right now, Silas. The dead zone is lonely, but at least the rocks don't talk back." Silas's jaw tightened. He stepped aside, bowing his head in a jerky, forced movement. Inside, He doesn't have much time. The interior of the great hall was a nightmare. The air was so cold it burned the back of Elara's throat. In the center, on the raised dais, lay Kaelen. He was barely recognizable. The Alpha King was encased in a shell of jagged, translucent ice. It wasn't just on him, it was growing out of him. Great spikes of frost protruded from his chest, pulsing with a rhythmic purple light. Every pulse sent a shock wave of cold through the room. Elara felt her mark burn. It was humming now, a low vibration that made her teeth ache. This wasn't just a curse, it was a hungry, sentient force. "Move," Elara commanded. The healers scrambled away, terrified of the heat radiating from her mark. She climbed the dais and stood over the man who had ruined her life. Up close, Kaelen looked vulnerable. His powerful chest was stalled mid-breath. His golden hair was white with rime. Even in this state, he was beautiful, a fallen god of war. "You did this to yourself," she thought, her heart hardening. "You threw away the only shield you had." She reached out, her fingers hovering an inch above his frozen chest. "What are you doing?" An elder barked from the shadows. "Touch him! Use the magic!" "If I touch him now, the shock will shatter his heart," Elara said without looking back. "The blood frost is anchored to his soul. I have to trick the curse into thinking I'm him." She closed her eyes and began to hum, a dissonant, haunting melody her mother had taught her before the pack executed her. The silver tattoo on her arm began to leak black smoke. The smoke didn't rise, it fell, coiling around Kaelin's ice-encased body like a serpent. Soul to soul, blood to ice. Take the debt and pay the price. She slammed her palm onto the ice covering his heart. A crack like a lightning bolt echoed through the hall. Kaelin's eyes snapped open, not golden, but a terrifying, glowing violet. He let out a choked, guttural roar that wasn't human or wolf. The ice on his body began to liquefy, but it didn't turn to water. It turned to black mist, which immediately raced up Elara's arm, disappearing into her skin. Elara screamed. The pain was unlike anything she had ever felt. It felt like her veins were being filled with liquid nitrogen. Her knees buckled, but she forced herself to stay upright, her hand locked onto his chest. "Elara!" Kaelin's voice was a ghost of a sound, filled with agony and confusion. He looked up at her through the haze of pain. For a second, the Alpha King and the Outcast Omega were the only two people in the world. He saw the girl he had betrayed, now the only thing standing between him and oblivion. "You..." Kaelin gasped, his hand reaching up to grab her wrist. His grip was weak, but his skin was burning hot, the fever of the curse fighting back. "Don't speak, Thrail," Elara hissed through gritted teeth. Black veins were starting to spread from her mark, climbing toward her shoulder. "I'm not doing this for you, Kaelin. I'm doing this so you can live long enough to see what you've lost." With a final, violent surge of energy, the ice shell around Kaelin exploded into 1,000 shards. The violet vortex above the palace dissipated, replaced by a dull, gray sky. Kaelin slumped back, breathing hard, his skin returning to a flush of life. But Elara collapsed. She fell onto his chest, her body shaking violently, the black veins now reaching her neck. Kaelin caught her, his instincts taking over. As he looked down at the woman who had just saved him, he saw the black marks on her skin. He looked at the elders, his eyes flashing with a predatory rage. "The mark is spreading," Kaelin growled, his voice returning to its alpha authority. "What did she do?" Elder Malachi stepped forward, his face pale. "She didn't destroy the curse, Alpha. She took it into herself. She's binding her life to yours. If you want to stay alive, she can never leave you again." Kaelin woke up screaming, but the sound was muffled by the thick silk sheets of his royal chambers. His first instinct was to reach for his wolf,
but the beast was cowering, tail tucked. His second instinct was to find the source of the heat, the only thing keeping the chill from reclaiming his bones. He looked to his left. Elara was there, curled in a chair inches from his bed. She was asleep, but her rest was a battlefield. Her skin was unnaturally pale, and the black veins, the shadow frost, now reached all the way to her jawline. "She hasn't left for 3 days," a voice said from the shadows. Silas stepped into the light, looking exhausted. "Every time we tried to move her to the servant quarters, your heart rate dropped until your monitor flatlined. You're literally using her as a battery, Kaylin." Kaylin pushed himself up, his muscles screaming. "I exiled her, Silas. I threw her to the wolves, literally, and now I'm feeding on her?" "The pack is talking," Silas warned, his voice low. "They're afraid of her. They see those black veins, and they think she's the one who brought the curse. They want her back in the dead zone the moment the sun comes out." "They'll have to go through me," Kaylin growled, the intensity of his own reaction surprising him. Suddenly, Elara's eyes snapped open. They were no longer just violet. They were swirling with a dark, smoky mist. She gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if she were choking. Kaylin didn't think. He lunged out of bed, grabbing her hands. The black veins on Elara's neck receded slightly, flowing back down her arm. She let out a long, shaky breath, her body going limp against his chest. "Don't touch me," she whispered, though she didn't pull away. Her head rested right over his heart. "You're dying because of me," Kaylin said, his voice raw. "Why did you come back?" Elara pulled back then, her eyes hard and cold as the ice that had nearly killed him. She looked at the luxury of his room, then at his face, the face of the man who had broken her soul. "I didn't come back for you, Kaylin," she spat. "I came back because if the pack falls, the curse wins, and I'd rather die on my feet than let that thing have the satisfaction of freezing the world." She stood up, her legs wobbling. She walked to the window, looking down at the courtyard. Below, the pack members were gathered, staring up at the king's balcony. Their faces weren't filled with gratitude. They were filled with weapons and whispers. "They hate me," Elara said, her voice devoid of emotion. "They're waiting for you to get strong enough to kill me again." Kaylin stood up, walking toward her. He could feel the pull, the invisible thread between their souls tightening. Every inch of distance between them felt like a needle in his chest. "I won't let them touch you," he promised. "You said that 5 years ago," Elara reminded him, her voice finally breaking. "You said that the day before you watched them whip me." The silence that followed was suffocating. Kaylin had no defense. He was the king, and he had failed the only person who had ever seen him as a man. Before he could respond, a frantic banging echoed on the door. Riker burst in, his face covered in blood. "Alpha! The border! The ice! It's not just a curse anymore, it's taking form." "What do you mean, taking form?" Kaylin demanded. "The frozen statues of the scouts? They're moving," Riker choked out. "The ones who died in the first wave? They've stood up. They're coming for the gates, and they have the king's scent." Elara looked at her glowing mark, which was now pulsing a violent, angry red. "They don't have his scent," she whispered, looking at Kaylin with pure terror. "They have ours. The soul binding didn't just save you, it gave the curse a map to both of us." The screams from the courtyard were different this time. They weren't screams of pain, they were screams of pure, primal horror. Kaylin and Elara stood on the balcony, looking down at the gate. The Ice Walkers, the scouts who had been frozen solid days ago, were no longer statues. They moved with a jerky, rhythmic clicking sound, their limbs snapping like breaking branches with every step. Their eyes weren't eyes anymore. They were pits of glowing violet fire. "They aren't alive," Elara whispered, her hand gripping the stone railing so hard it cracked. "But they aren't dead either. The curse is using their nervous systems like puppets." Kaylin turned to Silas, his alpha command returning in full force.
Fire, arrows, oil, everything. If it's ice, melt it." "We tried," Silas yelled back from the courtyard. "The fire turns black the second it touches them. It's like the heat is being sucked into a vacuum." Elara felt the black veins on her arm pulse. A sudden, sharp memory pierced her mind. Her mother's face, illuminated by the glow of a hidden basement, pointing to the silver mark on Elara's arm. "The world will call you a parasite, Elara, but you are a bridge. You are the only thing that can carry the weight of a god's anger." "Kaylin, get back," Elara said, her voice dropping an octave. "I'm not leaving you," he growled, reaching for her. "I didn't say leave. I said get back." She turned to him, her violet eyes swirling with smoke. "The reason my magic was banned wasn't because it was evil. It was banned because it requires a bridge between two worlds. I am the bridge, and right now, the bridge needs to open." She stepped to the very edge of the balcony. Below, an ice walker slammed its frozen fist into the iron gate, and the metal shivered like glass. "Malachi," Elara shouted to the elder cowering by the door, "tell him the truth. Tell the king why you really burned my family." Malachi's face went ghost white. He looked at Kaylin, then at Elara. "We had to. The soul binding. It doesn't just share a life, Kaylin. It shares everything. If she opens the bond fully, she can pull the curse out of the pack, but she'll see every secret, every sin, every lie ever told in this fortress." Kaylin looked at the elder, then at Elara. The realization hit him. The elders hadn't feared the magic. They feared the truth. "Do it," Kaylin said, stepping up behind Elara. He wrapped his massive arms around her from behind, his chest pressing against her back. The heat of his body was the only thing keeping her upright. "Open the bond. See it all. If there are sins in this pack, let them burn." Elara let out a sob, half relief, half terror. She reached back, lacing her fingers through Kaylin's. "It's going to hurt," she warned. "I've been cold for 5 years, Elara," he whispered into her ear. "Give me the fire." Elara screamed as she threw her arms wide. The silver tattoo on her arm didn't just glow, it tore open. Shards of light erupted from her skin, forming a massive ethereal web that stretched from the balcony down to the courtyard. The web hooked into every single wolf in the pack. Suddenly, the battery effect Kaylin had felt was magnified by 1,000. He saw Elara's memories, the hunger of the dead zone, the sting of the whip, the loneliness that felt like a physical weight. And then he saw the pack's memories. He saw Elder Malachi meeting with a hooded figure in the woods years ago. He saw a vial of violet liquid being poured into the pack's sacred well. The curse wasn't an accident. It was a coup. As the truth flooded their minds, the magic reacted. The black veins on Elara's body turned a blinding molten gold. She reached out toward the ice walkers, and the golden threads of her web tightened. The ice walkers stopped. They began to vibrate, the violet fire in their eyes flickering. "Release them!" Elara roared. A massive shockwave of golden energy blasted outward. The ice walkers didn't just melt, they shattered into steam. The violet blizzard that had been choking the fortress for days was suddenly sucked toward Elara, spiraling into her mark like water down a drain. But the cost was immediate. Elara's body arched, her eyes rolling back. The black veins hadn't just reached her jaw, they had reached her eyes. And in the silence of the now clear courtyard, Malachi didn't look relieved. He looked at the shadows in the corner of the great hall and whispered, "He's here, the one who gave us the vial. The true king is here." The great hall was silent, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a pack that had just seen their history rewritten in streaks of golden and black magic. Kaylin knelt on the stone floor, cradling Elara's limp body. Her eyes were closed, but beneath the lids he could see the faint, rhythmic glow of violet fire. The black veins on her skin were no longer just marks, they were raised, pulsing like a second heartbeat. "Step away from her, Kaelin," a voice boomed from the shadows of the high rafters. The true king stepped into the light. He wasn't a wolf, not entirely. He was tall, gaunt, and dressed in robes that seemed to be made of frozen smoke. His skin was the color of a winter twilight, and his eyes were twin voids of absolute zero. "The Frost Wraith," Malachi whispered, falling to his knees. "The original Alpha." "I am the winter this pack forgot," the Wraith said, his voice echoing like ice cracking in a deep cavern. "I gave the elders the vial to cull the weak. I didn't expect a little parasite to swallow my entire curse." Kaelin stood up, his wolf surging to the surface, his claws extended, scraping against the stone. "She isn't a parasite. She's the savior you didn't account for." "She is a vessel," the Wraith countered, tilting his head, "and she is full. One more drop of my power and she will shatter, taking you and every wolf in this valley with her. Give her to me, and I might let the rest of you crawl away in the dark." Kaelin looked down at Elara. Through the bond he could feel her soul. It wasn't just a battery anymore, it was a library. He saw the Wraith's history, how he had been exiled centuries ago for trying to turn the pack into an army of the undead. He saw that the Wraith wasn't attacking, he was reclaiming. He needed Elara because she now held the concentrated essence of his power. "No," Kaelin said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "No?" the Wraith laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "You think your alpha strength matters here? You are tied to her. If I hurt her, you bleed. If I freeze her, you stop." The Wraith raised a hand and a bolt of pure violet frost shot toward Elara. Kaelin didn't think. He threw himself in front of her, bracing for the impact. But the hit never came. Elara's hand shot up, catching the bolt of frost in her palm. She didn't open her eyes, but a shockwave of heat erupted from her body, melting the frost instantly. The black veins on her skin suddenly flared with a brilliant molten orange light. "You're in my head," Elara whispered, her voice layered with 1,000 echoes. "I can feel your hunger. I can feel your fear." She stood up slowly, her movements unnaturally graceful. The shadow frost on her skin began to shift, rearranging itself into ancient runes that glowed with a terrifying heat. "The Omega is gone," Silas whispered from the sidelines. She's something else. "She's a soulbinder who has tasted the blood of a god," Malachi whimpered. Elara looked at Kaelin. For the first time, there was no hate in her eyes. There was only a deep, tragic understanding. Through the bond, she shared a single thought with him. "I can hold him back, but only if you give me everything. Not just your life, your throne." Kaelin didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee before her, the Alpha King bowing to the Outcast Omega. "Take it," Kaelin roared. "All of it. The pack, the blood, the crown. It's yours." As he surrendered his authority, the golden energy of the Alpha office flowed out of him and into her. The room turned blindingly bright. Elara wasn't just a bridge anymore. She was a sun. The Wraith shrieked, his smoky form beginning to dissipate under the sheer intensity of the combined Alpha and soul-binding magic. "You fools! You're burning your own lives to keep a flicker of warmth." "We're burning the past," Elara said, her voice echoing through the minds of every wolf in the fortress. With a final surge, she pushed the energy outward. It didn't just hit the Wraith, it hit the elders, the warriors, and the very foundations of the castle. The truth of the coup, the betrayal of the bloodline, and the Wraith's influence were scorched away. The Wraith vanished into a pile of gray ash, his power reclaimed by the woman he had tried to use. But as the light faded, the silence returned, heavier than before.
Elara stood in the center of the hall, her skin smoking, the runes on her arms glowing a dull, dying red. She turned to Kaelin, her face pale, a single tear of black ice rolling down her cheek. "It's done," Elara whispered. Elara stumbled, her body beginning to turn translucent. "Kaelin, the bond, it's too heavy. I saved the pack, but I've unraveled the threads of my own life." She looked at her hands, which were starting to fade into mist. "I'm leaving, Kaelin, and because of the bind, I'm taking your soul with me." The Great Hall was no longer a battlefield. It was a sanctuary of dying light. The ash of the frost wraith settled on the floor like gray snow, but no one was looking at the remains of the enemy. Every eye was fixed on Elara. She was fading. Her hands, once scarred and rough from years in the dead zone, were now shimmering, turning into a fine silver mist. The soul bond, the very thing that had saved Kaelin, was now a black hole, sucking the last of her life force into the void left by the curse she had devoured. "No!" Kaelin roared, lunging forward. He tried to grab her shoulders, but his hands passed right through her, meeting only a chill that vibrated with the sound of 1,000 weeping voices. "Elara, look at me! Stay with me!" "I can't," she whispered, her voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. "The debt. Kaelin, the magic always takes a life. I redirected the frost, but I didn't destroy it. I became it." Silas and the remaining warriors stood back, their heads bowed. The pack that had once hated her now watched in hushed reverence. They had seen an Omega do what no Alpha in their history had dared. She hadn't just fought for them, she had become their shield. Elder Malachi crawled forward, his face bruised and bloody. "There is one way," he wheezed, his voice filled with a desperate, newfound loyalty. "The final binding, the marrow lock." Kaelin turned on him, his eyes flashing a lethal gold. "Tell me, now." "The bond they have is mental and spiritual," Malachi explained, pointing to the glowing silver runes on Elara's fading arms. "It's a bridge of light. To save her, the bridge must become stone. You must bind your physical hearts, your blood, your bone, your very breath." "Do it," Kaelin commanded. "But you don't understand, Alpha," Malachi said, his voice trembling. "If you do this, you aren't just saving her, you're giving up your humanity. You will never be able to shift into a wolf again. You will be a hybrid, half man, half wraith. And if she dies, you will cease to exist in the same second. You won't just die, you will be erased." Kaelin looked at Elara. She was almost transparent now. He could see the stone pillars of the hall through her chest. "Kaelin, don't," Elara breathed. "You're the king. The pack needs an alpha, not a ghost. Let me go. I've done what I came to do."
Kaelin reached out again. This time he didn't try to grab her. He closed his eyes and focused on the golden spark of the alpha power he had surrendered to her earlier. He reached for the tether between them, the thin, screaming wire of agony and love. "The pack doesn't need a king who sits on a throne while his soul vanishes," Kaelin said, his voice steady for the first time since the collapse. He looked at his warriors, at Silas, at the people who had watched him exile this woman. "I failed her once," Kaelin said, his voice booming through the hall. "I will not fail her at the end of the world." Kaelin grabbed a discarded silver dagger from the floor. Without blinking, he sliced a deep gash across his own palm, then reached into the mist that was Elara's hand. "Malachi, the words!" The elder began to chant in a language so old the stones of the palace seemed to groan in response. The air in the room grew heavy, the atmospheric pressure rising until the warriors' ears began to pop. "Blood to blood," Kaelin repeated, his voice straining. "Life to life." A bolt of black lightning struck the center of the hall, connecting Kaelin and Elara. Elara screamed as her body suddenly solidified. The mist turned back into flesh, but it was a violent, agonizing process. Her bones snapped and reset. Her heart, which had stopped beating, kicked into a frantic, thundering rhythm. But as she returned, Kalen changed. His golden eyes turned a permanent, piercing violet. His skin grew pale, and a frost-like pattern began to etch itself into his neck, the same mark Elara had carried. He slumped to his knees, his breathing coming in ragged, icy puffs. The Alpha King was gone. In his place stood something new, something the pack feared even more than the frost. Elara fell into his arms, her body solid, warm, and trembling. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with the realization of what he had done. "You're tied to me," she whispered, touching the frost mark on his neck. "Why? After everything, why?" Kalen leaned his forehead against hers. "Because the dead zone was quiet, Elara, and I've realized I'd rather burn in your fire than be safe in the cold." Outside, the violet snow began to fall again, but it wasn't the Wraith's curse. A horn sounded from the northern pass, a sound that hadn't been heard in 1,000 years. The Frost Wraith wasn't a lone monster. He was a scout, and the rest of his army had just arrived at the gates.
The horn sounded again, a mournful, low frequency that shattered the remaining glass in the great hall. Beyond the broken gates, the horizon was no longer black. It was a wall of shimmering, ghostly violet. Thousands of frost wraiths, an army of the ancient dead, were pouring through the northern pass. They didn't march, they drifted, a tide of absolute zero intended to erase every living thing in the valley. "They're here," Silas whispered, his sword trembling. "The scouts were just the beginning. This is a harvest." Kalen stood up. He was no longer the Alpha King, but something more terrifying. His skin was traced with glowing frost runes, and his eyes were twin voids of violet flame. He looked at his hands that could no longer shift into a wolf, but could now command the very chill that had once tried to kill him. "Silas." Kalen's voice was a chorus of echoes. "Get the pups and the elders to the lower sanctum. Bar the doors with iron and salt." "And you?" Silas asked. Kalen looked at Elara. She stood beside him, her silver mark burning so bright it was painful to look at. The marrow lock had unified them. They weren't two wolves anymore. They were a single, devastating weapon. "We are going to give them the one thing they don't have, a heart." They stepped out onto the shattered balcony. The army of wraiths hit the fortress walls like a wave. The few warriors left in the courtyard were being turned to ice in seconds. The air itself was screaming. Elara reached for Kalen's hand. The moment their palms met, the frost runes on his skin and the silver marks on hers synced. A pillar of white fire erupted from their joined hands, shooting straight into the bruised sky. Soul to soul, blood to ice. They didn't jump, they plummeted. They hit the center of the courtyard like a meteor of golden light. The shockwave disintegrated the first 100 wraiths instantly. Elara became a whirlwind of silver energy, her soul-binding magic reaching out and grabbing the wraiths, not to kill them, but to pull the stolen life force out of them. Kalen moved with her, his hybrid speed a blur. He didn't use a sword. Every time he touched a wraith, he used the shadow frost in his veins to freeze the freeze, shattering the ghosts into harmless steam. But there were too many. The King of Frost, the original commander of the army, towered over the gate, a 40-foot titan of jagged ice and spite. He raised a massive sword made of frozen souls and slammed it down toward the center of the courtyard. "Elara!" Kalen roared. He threw himself over her, the soul bond flaring. The massive ice blade hit his back. Any other wolf would have been cleaved in two, but because of the marrow lock, the damage was shared. Elara felt her own back scream in agony as Kalen's skin tore. She felt his lungs gasp for air, and in that moment of shared pain, the final truth of her magic was revealed. The soul binding wasn't about redirection, it was about multiplication. Kaelin, give me the heat. Give me every memory of the sun. Give me every spark of rage you have. Kaelin poured his soul into her. He gave her the memory of the first time he saw her. He gave her the heat of his shame, the fire of his regret, and the burning, desperate love he had hidden for 5 years. Elara's body didn't just glow, it turned into a sun. A massive, circular wave of golden violet fire exploded from her chest. It wasn't a blast of destruction, it was a blast of warmth. The violet snow turned to rain. The ice titan didn't shatter, it melted. The ancient trapped souls within it letting out a final sigh of relief as they faded into the ether. The army of the dead vanished. The sky cleared, revealing a dawn that felt like it had been gone for a century. The silence that followed was absolute. Elara collapsed into the mud and melting slush. Kaelin fell beside her, his back a ruin of scars and frost marks. The pack emerged from the sanctum, moving slowly, their faces wet with rain and tears. Silas reached them first. He looked at Kaelin, his king who could no longer lead as a wolf. He looked at Elara, the Omega who had become a goddess. "Is it over?" Silas asked. "It's over," Kaelin rasped. He looked at Elara, his violet eyes softening. She was breathing, but her silver mark was gone. Her skin was human. Her magic was spent. She was just a girl again, the girl from the dead zone. "You're okay," Kaelin whispered, pulling her into his lap. "We lost the wolf," Elara said, touching his face. Her voice was bittersweet. "You gave up everything to save a pack that hated me." Kaelin looked up at the warriors. They were all kneeling, not out of fear and not because of a decree. They were kneeling because they finally understood. "I didn't give up the wolf to save the pack," Kaelin said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I gave it up because a king without a soul is just a beast, and you are my soul." Elara survived, but she remained human, her magic gone forever. Kaelin stayed as he was, the hybrid king, a man who could walk through fire and ice but could never shift again. They ruled together, not as Alpha and Omega, but as the bonded. The pack never forgot the winter, and every year on the anniversary of the collapse, they didn't light fires for the king, they lit them for the girl who had been cast out, reminding themselves that the magic they once feared was the only thing that kept their world from turning to ice. In the end, it wasn't the strength of the Alpha that saved the Iron Claw, it was the heart of the one they tried to break.
10 years later, the region once known as the Dead Zone was no longer a graveyard. Because of the Marrowlock, the magic that had once been a curse had become a blessing. Where Elara walked, the frost didn't kill, it preserved, then melted into a nutrient-rich dew that brought life to the scorched earth. Lavender and white lilies now grew where there had once been only ash. Kaelin stood on the balcony of their new home, built at the very edge of the pack borders. He looked down at the courtyard where young pups played. They didn't growl when they saw Elara, they cheered. She was the Grand Protector, a title that carried more weight than Luna ever could. He felt a familiar warmth press against his back. Elara wrapped her arms around his waist, her head resting against the frost-scarred skin of his shoulder. Though he could no longer shift, his senses remained sharp. He could smell the rain on the wind and the scent of wild honey that always followed her. "Do you ever miss it?" she whispered. "The run, the hunt, the wolf?" Kaelin turned in her arms, his violet eyes reflecting the golden sunset. He took her hand, the hand that no longer carried a mark, but still carried his heart. "Every day," he admitted truthfully. "But then I look at you, I look at our pack, and I realize that the wolf was just a skin. This is life." He leaned down, kissing her forehead. In the distance, the first fires of the anniversary began to twinkle across the valley. The Iron Claw was no longer a pack of warriors defined by teeth and claws, but a family defined by the fire they shared against the cold. They had started as an Alpha King and an Outcast Omega. They ended as the architects of a new world. Thank you so much for following the journey of Kaylin and Elara. This story was born from the idea that our greatest strengths often come from the parts of ourselves we are taught to fear. Elara was cast out for the very magic that would eventually save everyone who turned their backs on her, and Kaylin had to lose his crown to finally find his soul. If you enjoyed this emotional werewolf saga, make sure to like and subscribe for more tales of forbidden magic, epic sacrifices, and the bonds that defy even the coldest winters. Who is your favorite character? Would you have made the same sacrifice as Kaylin? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay warm.